I can start early if you'd like, but I think we should be on time, right? Okay. So 4 more minutes, guys. Stretch your legs, relax, and then we'll start. So it was explained to me that in Spain, 1 p.m. is still practically morning. So good morning to everybody here in the audience in sunny and beautiful Madrid, and to those who are connecting online. And welcome to this year's Energy Public Debates organized by the Norman Foster Foundation. I wish to personally thank Elena and Norman Foster for their charming hospitality and for hosting this important debate. In the 21st century, humanity faces 3 formidable challenges: climate change, geopolitical instability, and economic and social inequality. These 3 challenges are complex and intertwined. Responses to climate change will require both mitigation measures, for example, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, arresting deforestation, recovering CO2 from the atmosphere, as well as adaptation measures, for example, protecting coastal communities from rising sea levels, developing more water-efficient crops, relocating people and businesses. Geopolitical instability is rooted in old historical conflicts, as well as current competition for natural resources. Economic and social inequality means low standards of living in developing countries, but also concentration of wealth in developed countries. There is one tool that is key to the resolution of these 3 challenges. That tool is energy. The availability of plentiful, clean, reliable, and affordable energy will power climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts, will reduce competition for natural resources among the nations, and will drive new and beneficial economic activities on a global scale. In today's debate, you will hear from a group of experts who will reflect on these topics, each in their own diverse field. I will introduce them one at a time before they make their keynote remarks, 5 minutes each. I look forward to their presentations and the following question and answer time. Before I introduce them, I just realized that I forgot to introduce myself. So my name is Jacopo Buongiorno. I'm the TEPCO Professor of Nuclear Science and Engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. I'm also the Director of the Center for Advanced Nuclear Energy Systems at MIT and a long-term friend of the Norman Foster Foundation. So with no further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Sheila Foster. She's a professor of urban law and policy at Georgetown University. She's a leading scholar on environmental and climate justice. Sheila, please come on the stage. You have the floor.
Good afternoon. So let's start where most of us live, cities, right? Why should we care about cities when we talk about energy and climate change? Because according to the recent IPCC report, the International Panel of Experts, 75% of all global emissions come from cities. And it's not all cities. It's just really a handful of large cities in each country that is generating most of the carbon emissions that we see. So this suggests that cities working together, the collective action of large cities in particular, might make a difference in the transition to a more renewable future. And this is why 1 billion people who live in a city that has already set a target for renewable energy and have set policies for renewable energy. Just in the past couple of years alone, in 2020 and 2021 alone, hundreds of cities are putting in place these policies. But there's more room for innovation, and that's what I've been tracking, right? In addition to just setting a goal, cities are being more ambitious about what they're doing. They're facilitating distributed energy, moving away from centralized energy generation, which leaks and causes all sorts of problems. They're incorporating elements of energy democracy, or what we call energy justice sometimes, and they're acting together across boundaries. So I'm going to touch on each of these quite briefly in my few minutes. First of all, New York City just put in place probably the most ambitious reduction of greenhouse gases in its buildings. And this new law, which requires 60% of the buildings in New York City, if you've ever been to New York, you understand that footprint, to reduce their emissions quite significantly or face tremendous fines, sometimes over $1 million, before the year 2030. Right now, only 25% of the buildings in New York meet this ambitious goal. So this is one example of a city getting out ahead of this energy transition. 70% of greenhouse gas emissions in New York come from buildings, and the rest come from a variety of other sources. The other source of gas, even more than carbon, or of greenhouse gas emissions, even more than carbon, is natural gas. Natural gas often requires pipelines, which have been heavily contested, and other infrastructure very difficult to put in place. And as a result, looking at just one state, we see dozens of local governments banning natural gas hookups in new buildings. This is quite significant. As we also see here, this is a contested area in an era of political polarization. Many of the red states, as you see in the United States, are trying to preemptively ban local governments from doing this because of industry lobbying at the state level. Nevertheless, cities are finding a way around those bans. So that's a developing and contested space, but local governments are moving ahead and will continue to. The other thing that cities are doing are distributing energy. So in some cities, now we have to put solar panels on public buildings, but that's a start. What many cities are doing are catalyzing microgrids in particular neighborhoods. There's a new agency in Los Angeles that covers 11 of the counties and about 50% of the state's population that exists just to catalyze a community of microgrids in certain areas of Los Angeles. Microgrids can be attached to a number of buildings in a community. They can be connected and produce clean energy that is also distributed so that in a storm or other climate event, certain communities can be protected from power outages. One thing that cities are doing that speaks to energy justice or climate justice is that there are certain low-income communities in particular that are particularly vulnerable to storms and power outages. Some communities, as this one outside of Boston, are targeting microgrids to these frontline communities to protect them from the devastating impacts of climate change. It's what we call energy democracy, giving local communities a choice in how their energy is produced and also how it's priced, and also lowering their bills in the process. Finally, cities across the world are working together. You may have heard of C40, which is one of the largest international networks of cities, covering 97 cities, over 700 million citizens, and what they've been doing is setting ambitious goals, holding themselves to those goals and targets, pledging to divest from fossil fuels, and leveraging over $2.8 billion in funding to help cities make a just energy transition. So I'll stop there. Cities are important sites of the energy transition and also important sites of energy democracy. Thank you very much.
Sheila, thank you very much for the informative and spotlessly on-time presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. Ian McDonald. Ian is an architect and professor at ArtEZ in the Netherlands. He's also a personal friend of mine, and he focuses on global technology-led projects. So Ian, please come up the stage, and the floor is yours.
We think of cities, we think of buildings often in terms of museums, art galleries, airports, etc. But significantly, industrial architecture has been with us for hundreds of years. Whether it's energy generation, whether it's factories, whether it's new forms of energy, what is important and what is significant is the scale of this infrastructure, the scale and the way that this has impacted upon our environment. And even today, when you look at solar and wind and other forms, it's very big. But let's think about cities. What is the smart city, or what is the city of the future looking like? I think it's between the populated and the unpopulated space. It's the AI, it's the autonomous vehicles, it's the ability to have innovation districts, the densification. But more importantly, it's a kind of digital real estate, which is a mix of four things: data, productive architecture, infrastructure, and energy. You can't take them apart. And many people talk about cities in terms of everything except energy, and yet going back to the industrial architecture, it takes up so much of our environment. Let's focus on data for a moment. I work a lot in data, and data, of course, consumes a huge amount of energy and is continuing to consume it at a fast pace. Everybody's been working from home. Everybody uses a mobile phone. That has to go somewhere. This huge infrastructure, as you can see here, is 2% of the world's electricity, and it will double in 2 years' time. Let's think about Madrid for a moment. What about Madrid? If Madrid's 315,000 vehicles were doing, say, 17,500 kilometers a year each, we made them all electric, that would be 1 terawatt hour of electricity annually. That's a phenomenal amount of energy. So not all the solutions are as easy as we think. We have blackouts, and we're experiencing blackouts because we're doing so much with the energy that we may not need to do with it. We're gaming a lot. We've got cryptocurrency mining. It's not essential. Well, it is essential, but is it as essential as some other things? So if I want to scale down this significant architecture, perhaps we could look at smaller plants. What about a small modular reactor, carbon-free, different from wind, different from gas? It would only be the size of a couple of football fields. Now, if I want to go even lower, that would produce 300 megawatts, or 450 in an extreme case. What if we go down to what we call a nuclear battery? It can fit within a sea container. You put a turbine beside it, you get 10 megawatts in 12 meters. So what would happen if, to take the energy democracy aspect, we decided to stop planning our cities around this legacy infrastructure, all the pipes, all the systems that we have, and said, can we actually do something in a more agile way? And could we then break it down and do it again in 20 years' time? So imagine a derelict area beside Wembley Stadium in London, and we start to place some nuclear batteries, and we grow clusters of productive activity, clean tech, vertical factories, different types of activity around it, and we let them cluster where they need to be, and then we put in some SMRs when it needs to get bigger, and then over time we say, perhaps we break this down. But what's important about this is we can move the source rather than we're stuck with this investment, we're keeping it here for 100 years. And of course, what I'm thinking here is like a super Soho, it's dense. It's about the human scale as well. It's about human control. But going on with this aspect of productivity, we take up so much space, but many of the new forms of activity are clean. In fact, if I put all the forms of clean tech into this building and I had a school next door, the children would be the noisiest source because the e-vehicles wouldn't be. So one of the aspects is, what if I took this, but I'm not going to do new development? I want to replicate this within the buildings that we like, we love, but to some extent we need to find new uses for. Can we bring this right into the center of town? I'm going to let you guess for a moment which building this is. Imagine this building has been stripped back to its shell and core, and we're going to put some nuclear batteries into it. And it's going to power up all that's going to happen within this building. And then more importantly, we're going to celebrate the batteries as a sculpture within this building that now has a completely different life. And within this, at the bottom, will be the batteries. And the batteries will themselves become the star of the show. So our own little Guggenheim, but it's about energy. It's about empathy. It's about not being afraid. It's about seeing something in a different way and seeing its value. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ian, also very disciplined. So our third speaker is Dr. Luke Olsen. He's an architect and associate professor of architecture at the University College of London, and his specialty is interdisciplinary education in architecture and engineering. So, Luke, you have the floor. Come here.
It's like being back on a school play. I'm very happy to be here, and I just want to take you through some of the projects we're working on at the moment. The latest project, which is, believe it or not, a bit of a world first of bringing together three disciplines that conventionally have been working together, but over the years become siloed. And that's the world of architecture, service engineering, building service engineering, and civil engineering and structural engineering in one degree. It's been an incredibly complex process to blend and bring back these parts. So I want to start in a way with a kind of a renaissance, this idea that beautifully is explained here in 1488 of to understand what the world is, we have to see it from multiple perspectives. This is really fundamental, that understanding of things from different boundaries and all spaces at once allow us insight and ultimately better design. And I think this is the ambition of this program, which I've been setting up. We're all here to try and resolve some of the major issues that we've been dealing with, which are becoming alarming in terms of the temperature changes, becoming alarming in terms of the amount of CO2 that we're producing, the carbon. And we need to take radical action. Now, to do that, that means taking risks, designers taking risks, ambitious designs that integrate expertise, but do things differently. Now, that's not a straightforward process. So to develop that, we brought together in this program, and through an accreditation process as well, so it's all been written specifically to meet all of the criteria of engineering and architecture simultaneously, and reconstructed it. And this diagram is a sort of simplified but overview of the thing. The secret, I think, of this program is the triptych, the three. It's the minimum number of points you need to hold something, and it's also the ability to have change and continual change and discussion and different solutions coming out. And at the center of it all is the design studio. So the students on the program have an expert in architecture, expert in civil engineering, and expert in building service at every conversation. So it becomes an open-ended and exploratory form of design, but it also deals with fundamental facts, real, robust understanding, engineering understanding, you know, things that you don't have to reinvent, that allow you that ability to integrate innovative ideas. This is the, perhaps a bit of a boring slide actually, but I find it one of the most useful to give you an insight. These are just the modules on that four-year integrated program. And you can see we start with a history and theory almost of everything. You know, there's this sort of understanding of the Big Bang right through to now. But the next thing, and this is crucial, and they intertwine, is mathematics. And this ability to integrate models, integrate math, integrate understandings that we've got in design, and integrate the energy systems that we have to work with. So the third module, building physics and energy, is exclusively looking at energy, including making things like photovoltaic cells or different alternative forms of energy. Alternative is really important. And then the sort of whole half of the base is design. So 50% of the program is design. And in that you have these extraordinary open-ended conversations, but the ability for students then to become experts in their fields is something we really want to develop as well. So as the years go by, you can see that the depth of knowledge increases, but also the ability for students to then find their niche, find their modus operandi, their sort of expertise that they'd like to have in this vast field of architecture and engineering. So they've got electives, and they've got UCL, which is an enormous institution to select modules from that they might then develop as part of their design. So in the fourth year, it really becomes about a fully integrated, omnidisciplinary set of projects, both the dissertation, but also the radical ideas that come out of the design projects. I've only got 5 slides, so I can only show you a very short snapshot. This is just first year to fourth year. But I just wanted to show this as in first year, the only way you can really get involved in an integrated conversation is to build something. And I think that's where we ask students in first year to make something one-to-one. They build pavilions, whatever pavilions are. Those can be interpreted as multiple things. This is one pavilion, an acoustic pavilion that changed and generated its own energy that was about creating a more comfortable zone in a very busy and open place. And then at the end, you've got one drawing by one omnidisciplinary graduate. We only just have our first graduates last June, so we're a very new program. And Muse was looking at the use of hydroelectric power as part of a solution towards developments, informal developments in Mumbai, as a source of energy. So there was integrating hydroelectric power into, in a sort of acupuncture-like way into some of the more challenging spots of Mumbai. And that's it. I may have done it shorter than 5 minutes.
Thank you, Luke. So after the power of 3 comes the power of 4. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Holly Sam Olsen. She's Associate Professor of Architecture at the Graduate School of Design at that other university upriver. I forgot. Harvard University? So, just joking, of course, but, you know, mandatory joke from an MIT professor to a Harvard professor. So, Holly, come up on stage. Her research focuses on the design of buildings. Sorry, I was about to say her research focuses on the design of buildings impacting climate change and human health. Holly, you have the floor.
Thank you all for joining, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here today. I've had the experience of teaching students while their families were home facing down wildfires, mudslides, floods, and hurricanes. So this slide is a personal reminder to me of how much work we have left to do. buildings account for 38% of the global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. And to me, this is good news. Because buildings are also one of the most cost-effective opportunities to abate carbon in our industries. What this graph is showing is that we can make money in general while abating carbon in buildings. Our former US Energy Secretary, Stephen Chu, said energy efficiency isn't just low-hanging fruit, it's fruit laying on the ground. As architects, though, are we just trying to save energy, or is it actually something else? Is it greenhouse gas emissions? Is it utility costs? Is it the health impacts of the way that we generate much of our energy today? And as architects, I'm starting to wonder if we need to think about the fact that all kilowatt hours are not created equal. What this figure is showing is a typical daily net electricity use profile for California. That's a grid that has increasingly added more and more solar generation over the years. What happens in California and at other places in the US and elsewhere that have high amounts of renewable intermittent generation is that the wholesale price of electricity can actually go negative at times. Yes, you heard me right. Generators would pay money. So these economics are not incentivizing more renewables to be added to the grid. Now, we could look at a similar situation where there's a lot of wind power, and it's not as regular, but we would still see some daily and seasonal patterns. So my question is, can and should architects start designing for these patterns? I think we need more grid interactive building controls, and we also need more short-term and seasonal thermal storage. So things like water tanks, ice storage, phase change materials, maybe borehole seasonal storage to store heat from one time to another, or other strategies that you might develop. And of course, we need appropriate passive design measures. So we have the smart building technologies. I think we also need the dumb building technologies. And not only to just bring down those overall energy uses, but maybe we need to think about passive design and how it affects the timing of energy use. So my team pulled together this analysis to demonstrate to you what I'm talking about. So let's consider window selection for a minute. We have to select for the glass how much solar heat gain we want to let in. And we're paying for the glass anyway, so we might as well get this right. So what we did was we simulated a prototypical south-facing apartment building, and we put it in different locations in the US with different climates and different grid makeups. So if we just wanted to follow the energy code, we would probably pick the number on the red line. Or we could use simulation and we can optimize for bringing down those overall energy emissions for the year. And then we would follow the light blue bars. But if we imagine a scenario where we have a site or a grid that's heavily powered by solar, so then we want to use the energy when the sun's shining. So we would actually follow the blue bars. And in this analysis, the energy and emissions impacts are not small. Here we found savings of 19 to 60% of overall heating, cooling, and lighting emissions. Now, this is a thought exercise, and I'm not expecting anyone to go out and use these numbers, but what I am suggesting is that maybe going forward, when we're doing building designs and when we're writing building policies, maybe we also need to think about the future of our energy infrastructure and vice versa. And I would be remiss not to mention that embodied emissions matter. So while we're renovating these buildings, while we're building this infrastructure, we're going to be putting some sort of spike in greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And a ton of carbon today has the opportunity to do more damage than a ton of carbon sometime in the future. I think we need to get to the point where we can think about that time value of carbon as regularly and in as sophisticated a manner as we think about the time value of money in our real estate and investment and infrastructure investment decisions today. Recent research showed that in 2018, 1 in 5 premature deaths globally were caused by fossil fuel emissions. That's 8 million deaths. Now, this is not homogeneous around the globe, but if you're somewhere where fossil fuels are combusted, you're feeling these impacts. So my question is, if fossil fuels are responsible for huge numbers of premature deaths, if buildings are the end use for a portion of these fossil fuels, and if buildings are one of the cheapest fixes, then is architectural design a form of triage, When we say that architecture impacts lives, are we being literal? But there is hope. We have a number of affordable opportunities in building design where global human and planetary health goals align, and we can do so in a cost-effective manner. And this gives me great hope. Thank you.
Please stay on the stage. And I'm going to ask my other three speakers to join us up here. So I had a chance to look at their slides a few days ago and prepare some questions to kick off the debate. So I'll take care of the first round of questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Okay, so let's start with Sheila. During the past 10 years in the United States, we've witnessed a great deal of activism on climate change mitigation policies by individual cities and states. Often such policies have been in conflict with federal policies, especially during the previous administration. This is certainly not the most effective way to make progress. How do you see the importance and balance of local, national, and international level actions play out in the years to come?
So that's a great question. We are in a multi-level system of governance, and whether we're talking about the relationship of the UN to nation states and the nation states to their regional governments or national governments, or whether in the US we're talking about the federal government, states, and localities. And in a system of multi-level governance, when one part of the system isn't functioning well, isn't putting into place responsive policies, the great thing is the other part of the system can do so. And so we saw President Trump, for instance, pull out of the Paris Agreement, and there's been no action on the national level around climate change, at least in legislatively. Cities have stepped into this void. And I think that's, number one, important. That's a feature, not a bug, of the system. And the second thing I would say is that, that lower levels of government are laboratories for policies and laboratories of democracy. So a lot of what the Biden administration is doing now on climate has scaled up from what's been happening at the local level and at the state level. And that's a good thing. So I think, and they're closest to the people. Right? City governments are closest to the people, and they're able to respond more reflexively and more aptly. So I think all those are really good things.
Okay, Sheila, thanks for helping us put this into context. Maybe a follow-up question is, now zooming out to the international level, a lot of these big international agreements often feel very ambitious, properly ambitious, but also a little bit aspirational, and it seems very difficult to make sure that then the individual countries follow through. Is there any way to strengthen a little bit the effectiveness of these international agreements, in your opinion, and if so, how?
So I think you've hit on something, right? That's implementation, right? We have nation states signing these agreements for goals, but who's going to put them into effect? And again, when they sign the goals and then go back and national governments aren't being effective in doing it, and even when they are, we still have to implement them often at the local level. Why? Because the impacts of climate change, and a lot of these impacts happen in our communities. And so, so cities have become a way of making these things happen. They're not the only actors, of course, and multinational networks like C40, like ICLEI, are actually spending a lot of effort and money putting in place policies that are often more ambitious than the international agreements.
The international
yes,
agreements.
Exactly.
So absolutely, the value of local action.
And that's quite significant when you think about, again, a handful of cities are producing most of the carbon emissions. So if they can collectively act together, that's a powerful intervention.
Thank you, Sheila. Great segue into my question for Ian, which is going to be a little bit longer introduction, but I think it's important to put it in context. There appears to be a trend to reintegrate industrial production into the fabric of cities. In a way, this is a return to the origins, when cities would grow on rivers around big industrial facilities enabled by the availability of plentiful water and cheap hydropower. I think this modern trend has three motivations. The first is technological. It is nowadays possible to modularize and miniaturize industrial production without greatly sacrificing efficiency. I think you alluded to this in your presentation. Number two, there is a desire to maximize the local economic impact of industrial production. And number three, there is a need to reduce the environmental impact and vulnerabilities which are typical of large interconnected transmission and distribution infrastructures, such as the power grid. In your opinion, what are the implications of this trend toward urbanizations of industrial activities on energy production and consumption? You mentioned the nuclear batteries, but please elaborate.
Yeah. So I think one of the aspects that we need to think about is, why do we want to be productive in cities? You hear a lot of discussion about innovation areas, densification, but when you talk to people who make things, they say the prototype needs to be worked on, and then you pass that back to the designer, and it's an iterative process. If the designer is in America and the producer is in China, how does that work in terms of the community and knowledge and other aspects? Then there's the other aspect of, what about equality, inclusiveness in knowledge and in the ability to actually make and do things, to become a local entrepreneur? So in order to do that, we have to break free from a large restrictive system. Now in cities, one of the aspects is, what is holding back this change? I think it's two things. We've got 20th century planning systems, and we've got 19th century building codes. And everywhere you want to do something with, say, local energy, has to be a licensed site. So we need to think about the fact that mayors will change in 3 to 5 years. The CEO normally changes in 3 to 5 years, and the banks want the money back in 3 to 5 years, or the first payment. So how can we actually make a difference? To me, one of the aspects is, if you take a Glasgow or Detroit where there's lots of space, but space is still a premium, then we obviously have to concentrate and cluster, but we shouldn't always think of things as permanent. We can see from Industry 4.0 and maybe Industry 5.0 that things start, they build, sometimes they fail, they reconfigure. If we have the energy source in that distributed way with some local control, which is more egalitarian, I think we've then got the basis to reprogram the city. And it's about, to me, reprogramming the city, a new urban code.
Thank you, Ian. Very good points. Let me move on to Luke's, and then we'll go back to Ian with questions from the audience. Policies and technology solutions to combat climate change at scale will necessarily have to come from government and industry. However, academia, an environment that we all know personally very well, can and should play a direct role beyond education. I'm thinking research, of course. At UCL, you have, as you presented, a master program in engineering and architectural design. Can you tell us how the graduates of this program can contribute designing solutions to the energy crisis?
I mean, that's a really fundamental point, that the graduates leaving any program make decisions about where they might go in their future. And in a multidisciplinary environment, the possible futures grow. You know, the different areas of expertise you might develop into grows. It's within the well-trodden paths that are in place, but it's also, what's really interesting is it's allowing for new forms of design and new forms of practice to exist between those spaces and beyond. And I think that the interest is actually about accessing the ability to be able to make real change, fundamental change. And to do that, you need to be a good designer. And I think the challenge to be a good designer in a multidisciplinary environment, it comes down to empathy. And I slightly disagree with one of the points you made, so breaking free of the grid. I don't think it is breaking free. I think it's working with it and turning it into something valuable, which at the moment it's not. And we have to acknowledge that. And I think that is a kind of dialogue. And I often say that, you know, she who controls the pen controls the conversation. And I think that ability to be able to present new futures is something that should be inherent, both in an engineering and in an architectural background, but ultimately in all possible influential design locations that you might find yourselves in. And that could be in positions of power in terms of political and transformative places in society.
I have to say on this question of centralized infrastructure versus distributed energy, I have, of course, my own opinions. I think there is going to be a role for both approaches because they really serve different sets of applications. If you think about, for example, the use of heat in industry, or by definition, it has to be local. You can't transport heat, for example, as a form of energy over hundreds of miles the same way that you can do with electricity. So you need something that is co-located. But certain power, electricity applications, of course, are best served by the grid. One thing that I think you touched lightly in your answer is in many ways creating a common language between two communities that naturally would tend to speak two very different languages. And I come from the engineering community and you come from the architecture community.
You never know.
And the past couple of days have been certainly fascinating and very educational for me to listen to people coming from this other community and being able to actually connect and communicate. So is that an explicit objective of your program, is to create some kind of common cultural ground so that people can move seamlessly in between these two communities?
I think so, absolutely. I mean, life is fairly long in some senses. You know, you start out with an ambition at one point when you graduate, but then you change and move to different locations. So that ability to be able to shift your, not necessarily identity, but your knowledge of the fields you're in will give you the capacity to move into new territories. And I think that in some ways it is about finding a common language, you know. But I think the answers are always, in design, different. You know, it's not that there's one answer, there's multiple solutions. And that does involve a bit of hand-holding. You know, that's an expression which I think I sort of understood in the world of architecture, there's a bit of hand-holding involved. Yeah. And I think that is, what's interesting from what I've seen with the graduates on the MEng at this level is that the hand-holding is there, but they're also a bit more cautious about leaping forwards. There's a kind of state of finding out that takes place to do with engineering principles, understanding a kind of wider implication, and then they leap forwards. And I think that's the interesting bit, this sort of time frame of decision-making that takes place. And hopefully we're making slower decisions. That's something I'm interested in.
Thanks. All right. So going to Holly, switching gear a little bit. Holly, given the growing global population and volume of international travel and human encroachment on wildlife habitat, it seems likely, sadly, that COVID-19 was not the last pandemic that we will see in our lifetime. In designing the buildings for this new world, how does one square the seemingly conflicting desire for energy efficiency, and the need to avoid crowded spaces and ensure high rates of ventilation?
Thank you. Actually, one of my favorite topics, so thank you. Well, I think gathering spaces, as we've learned so well over the past few years, are really necessary parts of our culture. So I don't think that they will or should go away. So let's talk about ventilation. When we have good weather and good outdoor air quality, then we can implement natural ventilation, economizer modes, et cetera. When we have the opportunity for new buildings or retrofit buildings, then we can institute high rates of ventilation with energy recovery. So enthalpy wheels or simple water loops to recapture some of that heating or cooling from the outgoing air to save energy on conditioning the incoming air. So I think the real crux of the problem is probably in older buildings in harsh weather. So what do we do there? Where we can, maybe ventilation, maybe alternative strategies like UV germicidal irradiation, just for the airborne disease part of that. Do we compromise? Do we pick, the moments, the coldest and the hottest moments of the year where maybe we say we're just going to bring in code minimum levels of air quality? Or do people like you and others give us clean forms of electricity so that we don't have to make this compromise between occupant health and global health, and we can provide both?
It sounds like you're not a fan of the hybrid working model anyway. So remote, we're done. We've had enough for the past couple of years. So you want people back in the buildings. And again, the past 2 days that we spent together have been fantastic in that sense, really. A lot of, let's hope nobody got COVID, but other than that. That's
I miss office buildings personally.
All right, very good. So we're going to open up now to the questions from the audience. I assume we have someone with the mics that can go around. So please raise your hand if you want to ask a question. And I would ask you to state your name, affiliation if you wish, and then keep your question very brief. And we'll just sort of dangling it in front of our speakers here and see who wants to bite. Okay, so let's see. Who wants to break the ice? Yeah, question over there.
Hello, good morning. I'm Ana Barrera, Director of the International Institute for Law and the Environment, Instituto Internacional de Derecho y Medio Ambiente. I have a few questions. First, I don't think that distributed energy is going to be the solution in the transition. So there are many problems. This is happening in Spain, and I'm sure in the United States too, on the seating of big projects. So my first question is for Sheila Foster. What kind of legislation do you have for public participation when selecting the seating of big energy project, and how is the conflicts are being solved? Because this is a huge conflict with biodiversity and landscape protection. Mm-hmm. So for Ian, my question is...
One at a time.
Oh.
Let Sheila answer, and then we'll go on to you.
Yes, I think siting of renewable energy and other forms of either centralized or distributive energy is a huge problem. Huge problem. There is, because we have laws at every level, the national, state, and local, that require public participation. And also, local governments control their home, their infrastructure, what gets sited, what gets built. So we see a lot of bottlenecks there. One of the things that's happening, and it's not just in the energy, it's also in housing, is that states are overriding that local power to be able to build more housing or to build more energy facilities. And that turns out to be quite controversial because it's in tension with energy democracy, with public participation. But if we want to scale up energy facilities, whether distributed or not, then we have to relax those local laws. And generally, the people living there don't want to relax them. They want to be more in control of what's in there.
I agree with everything you said. I want to just make the point that distributed energy, I would say, by definition, tends to be smaller scale projects. Yeah. So don't necessarily think about the traditional large power plants, whatever is your favorite energy source. We're talking about something significantly smaller. Let's go to the question for Ian and then somebody else in the audience.
It's very interesting, the nuclear batteries that you were talking about, but have you studied the life cycle? I mean, have you analyzed the life cycle of these nuclear batteries? So all the materials you need to produce, what will be, following the quotation of Leonardo da Vinci, that we have to think in a systemic manner. So what will be the impact of the materials you need to use, and at the end of life of those batteries, how are they going to be treated? Is it going to be low radiation nuclear batteries? So I have that question for you. Thank you.
Yeah. Very good question.
Mm-hmm. So, actually,
if you want, I can answer, but go ahead.
Yeah. I was thinking, So the layman's answer to that question, very simply, would be that, of course, the fuel type is changing. The types of materials which are lighter, stronger, that we can use for the encasement. And, of course, it's a plug-and-play system. So if you put these three things together, we're not dealing with the 1950s, but we're looking at a different scenario today. So like a gramophone to the iPhone to listen to music. But I think Jacopo would probably talk a little bit about what happens with the degraded material that we have within the battery, which I think is also part of your question.
Yeah, maybe we can take that offline. But basically, if what you're really asking, though, is what is the life cycle materials usage associated with this, it's actually pretty similar to traditional nuclear power plants, and therefore it's actually very efficient because the amount of materials per unit energy generated for nuclear is towards the lowest that you can think of. And that really stems, I should say, from the incredibly high energy density of nuclear with respect to other energy sources. So we can, but I want to make sure that other folks have a chance to ask questions in the audience. So let's go to someone else. And that clock over there says 2 minutes and counting down. Does that mean till the end of this Q&A and then we move on? If someone can let me know, I would appreciate it. There is a question back there. Yep.
Hello, my name is Juan. I'd like to ask you about the efficiency of the hydrogen energy that we are developing in Mallorca. And I'd like to ask also about the energy storage, because I don't understand producing a lot of energy if we cannot store, and if there is any method that you could talk about or we are developing.
So I think the question is, what's the efficiency of hydrogen production? I believe what you mean is, what's the ratio of the energy content of hydrogen to the energy required to produce it? Because hydrogen is not a primary energy source, It's not like wind, solar, or nuclear. It has to be produced from a primary energy source. So, and the preferred approach, if you want to do it without emitting CO2, is to split H2O, right, to break the molecule of water. Does anybody want to comment on this, or I'm the resident expert on that? Okay, I suppose I am. So it really depends on the process that is used, either low temperature or high temperature electrolysis. They have different efficiencies, but I would say, you know, around 70 to 80%. So it's relatively efficient process. Of course, the primary energy source that you use also has its own efficiency, and so, you know, that the overall efficiency tends to be a little bit lower than that.
Could I have
Yes.
one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, this is a very local question as well, which I think is really interesting, that there's the storage of energy and the use of energy is very particular to a place, and that ability to weave that into the decision-making process is crucial. So there's that, you know, I think there's solutions happening everywhere, and we want to celebrate the differences, I think, and I think that, you know, raising just hydro as a sort of conversation versus nuclear versus other forms, I think is where we should be discussing, because I think there's a lot at our disposal now. Technology has really come to an extraordinary place.
Yeah, and thank you. Look, I forgot the second question was about energy storage, so you addressed it, yeah.
So on the energy storage point, I mean, I think we need all kinds of solutions. We need the batteries, pumped hydro, the fuel cells. But I also think we need to kind of think from the bottom up, and where is that energy going? And there's a portion of it that's going to heat and cool buildings. And so in some cost-effective ways, that's what I was trying to get at, is that we can change the timing of that. So it could be as simple as you have an oversized water tank, you know, your water heater, it's just a little bit bigger, and you can control when you're producing that hot water, really based on signals from the grid. Or, like I was saying, maybe we can think about how we design buildings to slightly shift the timing of energy use. I mean, we're constantly making design decisions, especially in climates that are hot and cold. We're constantly making design decisions that are a compromise, maybe between our winter performance and our summer performance, our daily performance, things like building orientation, window size, glass selection, these kind of decisions that are going to last for decades. And so, you know, we can actually change some of the demand so that we need fewer of these other technologies for energy storage in the first place.
Good. Just make one very short point. We were talking about buildings today, about them being populated, but we have lots of buildings that are not populated at all. We have lights out factories. One of the CEOs of a major tech firm said, the future, in a word, automation. Now, if we were to build lots of buildings not designed for human occupancy, but for machine occupancy, what happens then to the city? What happens when you stray into an area where it's all lights out buildings, and they don't even look like the buildings we recognize? This spatial ambiguity, to me, is the nexus between architecture and engineering at the moment. We are just beginning to grapple with this question, that we may not be the only inhabitants in the city, and we may not be designing the cities just for humans.
All right, thank you. So the screen there says time is up. All right, so please join me in thanking our first four speakers, and we'll quickly transition to the second half of the session. So. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker of the second session. Is Dr. Frédérick Bordry. He is director for Accelerator, or former director for Accelerator and Technology at the famed CERN Research Center in Geneva, and a relentless advocate for the development of clean energy technology. So Frédérick, come up on the stage, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for your introduction. Thank you for the famous CERN. I appreciate it. Buenas tardes. Then I want to start speaking about energy, climate change. And I want to start always my presentation by this slide, to say that the energy world was sustainable to 150 years ago. You can see on this slide that it was wind, was the human force, was the horses, was a windmill. This is a photo I took in the Norman Foster Foundation, the things. But it was completely sustainable. After that, what we got as a major things, it was a machine. I will not describe all the invention, but it was a machine. And now we are living in a world of the machine. Before we have to feed ourselves by the food or by wind, solar, and so on. Now what is the main ingredient for this machine is coal, oil, and gas. I will come back later to that. Saying that this is exactly what a human body, I have more or less 10 watt in my arm, 100 watt in my legs. If I'm working hard, I can produce order of 100 kilowatt hour per year. But now, if we are looking in the world, thanks to the machine, we are at our disposal almost 20,000 kilowatt hour per year. What is a big, big change is a factor 200 per person. In our OECD country is a factor 600, what we have in availability in terms of power per year. What was the consequence on that? It was exactly from this time an increase of population. And an increase in population, it was, as I said, increase per capita. You have an increase of world energy consumption. And saying that, it was an increase of the GDP per capita. Then is a complete correlation between all these curves. Saying that also, we have to look at that, our life expectancy increased thanks to this increase of available power. And also, we have now holidays, we can work less per year, we can have nice conferences, we can go to theater, we have a better life. Then you can see the decrease, exactly correlation with that. But there is a price to pay. What is the price to pay? Is the emission of CO2 equivalent per year. And you can see from exactly correlation, and now we have the emission more or less of 40 billions of CO2, 40 billions of tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And if we are looking at that, what is the translation? Is the CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing that, and we are now close to 420 ppm of CO2 in the atmosphere. This is the last, thank you for the NASA. The last thing, we were expecting that we said in 2020 will be decreased. We come back to that, is no decrease. And in April 2022, we have the last record about the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. We have to be careful because every CO2 we put in, or equivalent CO2, after 100 years is still 40%. We have absorption by ocean, we have relative absorption. After 20 years, 1,000 years, still 20%. After 10,000 years, 10%. Then you have to be careful. Everything we emit is a long time thing. For that, I'm provocative. I said CO2 is sustainable. Sustainable in atmosphere things. And I had a discussion with some high-level political people in France. I will not give any name, but saying, okay, maybe in France, if we are very good and so on, we will have a very good CO2 concentration in France. But it completely forgets that the atmosphere, 1 in 2 years, the CO2 is completely mixed. Then we are not isolated. If we are very good in our country, be careful, this CO2 is completely mixed. And I think this is a very important, once again, good image from NASA. I think this is atmosphere is very thin. When you are looking at that, it's very thin. And we have to be our own crew shift. We have to really taking care of that if we want to look at the future of humanity. I always saying, save the planet. We don't want to save the planet. Our planet will be here in 5 billion years. Humankind, we have to save humankind. Okay. Now I'm looking at all this world consumption in different energy. You can see, don't forget this unit for time being, but 80% of the energy in the world is fossil energy. And we have always adding energy. Except wood at the beginning, we always adding energy. And we are adding renewable, but still oil and coal and so on, in percentage decreasing. In absolute term, it always increase. And we know that in 2050, we have increases of the population. Then increase of energy, increase of population, we have to do something. And the deal is to go to 0% of fossil in 2050. Then you can see the challenge in front of us, in front of you, is huge. But there is solution. I was very optimistic when I showed this slide 1 year ago. I said, oh, you decrease thanks to the COVID and so on. Shit, oh, sorry. After that, we look at that and we restart as business as usual. And now we are still increasing these things. Nothing we did not learn about the COVID crisis in terms of energy, in terms of fossil. I will conclude with some strategies possible. Yes, I think for me, one key word is sobriety. I think we have to look at that, how we can reduce our consumption. I'm taking this Sustainable Development Goal from UN, so yet there's still economic growth. I think growth is okay, but we have to be very careful because growth from people is employment. We have to go to sobriety, and maybe sobriety is not consequence on unemployment, but we have to change our mind. Okay, it was said that all the challenge, but the magnificent opportunity, we have to look at that and we have to think. I think I'm in favor, it was discussed before, a massive investment in new technology, renewable energy storage, but also in fission. And we have to look, we have technology now to do waste transmutation, subcritical reactor for safety, SMR, nuclear battery. And also we have to have a seed for the future. And I think fusion could be also a good source of energy in the future. And to conclude, when we want to control something you have to be aware about what you are doing. And I think personally, in all our organization, we have to measure our CO2 emission, and we have to do that. Difficult things, we have to be conscious that of large time constant. Then effort you will do tomorrow, today, you will see maybe in 20, 40, 30, 25, 30 years. Then this is difficult for people that okay, I'm doing something I will see later. And I will finish with two quotes. I think important, in nature, there are neither reward nor punishment, there are only consequences. Then we be careful. And I think the future of the humanity is not planned because it depends on the humanity. Save the humanity. Thank you very much.
Okay, Frédérick, thank you for this good overview. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, my colleague, Dr. Dava Newman. She's a professor of aeroastroengineering at MIT and the director of the MIT Media Lab. She's an expert in aerospace biomedical engineering and former deputy administrator at NASA. And I have to say she has the privilege to look at our planet from space, and that's what she's going to talk about. So, Dava, you have the floor.
Buenas tardes. It's a great privilege to be with you this afternoon. I'm so honored to be here, and thank you to the Norman Foster Foundation. I would like to tell you three stories, three planetary stories in the context of energy and environment this afternoon. To start my stories, it's always going to be about people. We're the actors, there's people. I love Frederick's line. I will reiterate it here. Earth, spaceship Earth, is going to be just fine. It really doesn't need us. So it's our choice. It's always about the people and our choices because we need spaceship Earth to live well. The Media Lab, we invent new technologies and try to give very innovative experiences to move people's hearts and minds to envision a positive future that we think is very realistic. My three stories, I'll start on the planet Mars, our sister planet, come a little bit closer to home about exploration and sending people out to the moon, and my favorite planet, Earth, end on Earth. So why do we explore? Here's our stories there. The reason we're explorers, human nature, in this case, going to Mars. We've been exploring Mars for 50 years, 5 decades, with our orbiters, with our rovers. It won't be till the next decade that we'll have humans on Mars. But in the meantime, we're exploring Mars half the size of Earth, to find the evidence of life, past life, probably 3.5 billion years old. But we look into history to inform ourselves because Earth and Mars, beautiful planets, but if life once existed on Mars, we want to know about the atmosphere, what the properties are for life to exist. Because life exists well on Earth, but it is very fragile as well. And this image, this is taken from what we call the Discover telescope. Here's the sun, here's Earth. Discover is halfway in between, 1.6 million kilometers out at the Lagrangian point. Why is it so important? It's the space weather buoy. Maybe you're sailors, we're big sailors. It says, hey, here's the sun's solar radiation, the sun's wind. And it says, hey, Earth, here's what's coming your way. We talked about power outages before. You might remember occasionally in solar storms in the time of high solar activity, sometimes we can lose the grid. What's out? It's not aliens, it is from space, but those are big, big solar storms. So the Discover probe that gives us these beautiful images is our solar system, our space weather buoy out there, telling us about space weather, not just weather here on Earth. We are currently today making oxygen on Mars. Might not be something you think about every day. It's something I think about every day because we want to learn to live off the planet. Now, Mars is not option B. I adamantly am opposed. Elon is a friend. I love SpaceX. They're doing great work. We don't want to send humanity to Mars. You really don't want to be on Mars, right? It's cold and dead, and you'd be in a spacesuit for the entire time in your own life support system. So Mars is not option B, but it's phenomenal. We already have nuclear energy, kind of like an older version of a nuclear battery. That's how we power Perseverance. Our rover that's currently on Mars today is powered by really, really efficient nuclear power. So we can do all the science. The science that we do is taking the carbon dioxide atmosphere. Mars has a 1% of Earth. We have one atmosphere here on Earth, our life support system. 1% carbon dioxide atmosphere on Mars. So plants are going to love it, right? But for humans and for fuel, we take the carbon dioxide atmosphere, we split off the carbon atoms, we have oxygen, we recombine the oxygen atoms, we end up with O2, oxygen. It's in the future, it's a technology demonstration. We only make about 6 grams every 8 hours. So it's for future fuel production for that round trip Mars mission that we see coming in the 2030s, as well as maybe a life support system, maybe oxygen for people in the future. Just a demonstrating technology, but the first time we've ever tried to use in situ resource utilization, or ISRU, living off the land. That's what successful exploration has done in the past historically. We think that's a good blueprint for the future. Again, living sustainably off the land, I should add, sustainably in harmony. So I spend a lot of time trying to keep people alive, healthy, well, my astronauts. As I mentioned, I think eventually we'll go to Mars, maybe in the coming decade. It's, again, round trip. It's just to look for the evidence of life if our rovers and our autonomous vehicles haven't already proven it. And we will send humanity to Moon very quickly, just in a few years. So we're developing the life support systems. We've all still going through this incredible pandemic. It's not a lot of fun to be in an isolated, confined environment. But I'm here to tell you, congratulations. You should get your astronaut wings. That's how we train astronauts. We always live in isolated, confined environments when we're training and going to these very extreme places. So, but you know, it takes its toll on mental health. You know, physical performance, mental performance, always being enclosed inside or always being enclosed in a life support system, having all of that around you. So it's difficult with exploration, but again, this is what we think about a lot, and looking at the new technologies, the new life support technologies, completely closed loop regenerative systems, providing oxygen, but scrubbing carbon dioxide and whatnot. So moving now to Earth. As I said, spaceship Earth, my favorite planet. This is actually an image of Earth in the middle, still very, very unexplored when we talk about our oceans, the deep oceans. I have better resolution maps of Mars than I do of the deep oceans on the Earth. That's where the biodiversity is. We need to know much, much, much more about our oceans, the biodiversity, economically moving forward, aquaculture to feed the world and the population, the numbers we've just seen. And then the exploration piece is just, this is to scale. These are mini moons, Enceladus, a little moon of Saturn, Europa, a slightly larger moon of Jupiter. Why do I have them on there? They're all ocean worlds. They all have oceans, so we think they might be teeming with life. So in terms of exploration, we go there. When you're searching for life, you follow the water. These are our ocean worlds. But again, the purpose of this is to really focus on Earth, on spaceship Earth. I want to share this simulation with you. We've talked about carbon dioxide in a few of the talks. Literal greenhouse gas, trapped greenhouse gas. So this is just 1 year of the carbon cycle. It's in 2014. Blue is going to be less than 400 parts per million. When you see yellow and orange, that's over 400 parts per million. You don't want to see yellow and orange. I'm going to show you this in 3 dimensions. You'll see 5 kilometers up, 10 kilometers up, 15 kilometers up, all the way up to 20 kilometers. And you see, today was 417 parts per million in terms of our CO2, our carbon dioxide. So again, the literal, human burning of fossil fuels as well as fires. That's the vital signs of Earth. And then to end, just thinking about the future, and we're using artificial intelligence, machine learning to demonstrate on the left here floods of the future. They haven't happened yet, but to get people out of harm's way, we can take a lot of space data, satellite data, and mostly on the right, you've probably heard of digital Earth, a lot of good work into recreate a digital twin of Earth, so we can run these simulations. And mostly it's about the people, hard to see, but in the top right, that we need to co-create this all together to see what the positive actions from our cities locally can be to help and the benefit of all of humanity and to live in harmony with Earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dava, and you're absolutely right. Unless you provide good Spanish food and wine, I'm not going to Mars for good. So let's stay with space with the third and last, but certainly not least, the speaker of this second session. It's Dr. Guillermo Trotti. He's a space architect and co-founder of the nonprofit Earth DNA, and has been working with NASA on advanced human missions throughout his career. So, Guillermo, Señor Guillermo.
Muchas gracias y buenas tardes a todos. Un placer estar aquí. Gracias a la Fundación Foster. Y bueno, I changed to English now. So, yeah, my experience really has been during my life is to work with NASA in advanced missions. From the early days of the space station to possible ideas to go to the moon and Mars, vehicles on the surface or in orbit. And I like to compare basically the architecture of space to what should we doing or what is starting to happen here on Earth. The idea of building smart buildings, because this is one of the smartest buildings that we have created. It's about 100 meters long. It has its own energy. It has the water, once it's there, is almost 98% recycled. 100% of all the fluids are recycled and redrinking. And so it radiates its own energy. It is supplied by different vehicles coming from Earth. And we have a healthy crew working there. For over 22 years, we have been living in this vehicle. About 6 months at a time. Some of the astronauts spend a year there. So it is is really kind of a self-sufficient piece of architecture. In the future, we will be going to Mars or maybe to the moon. We say we shoot for Mars. We make it to the moon in a few years. Dava said that maybe in the next decade we will be on Mars. But now the next target is really going to the surface of the moon. You know, using smart materials, again, inflatable structures that can be easily deployed, and again, the different types of energy. So the energy that we might use here is totally different than the energy that we had on the space station with solar, just with solar power, where people are just living and doing small experiments. If we're doing manufacturing or mining like we might be doing on the moon, we will need maybe some of these small nuclear reactors that we heard about today. Today, many satellites that are traveling through space are powered by small nuclear energy, given that they're going further away from the sun when they can pick up energy. So they have their own energy system. And the other one is obviously looking at local materials on the moon, using the regolith, using the soil to separate it and build from it. Very much like we are doing sometimes here on Earth, trying to look at the site. Specific sites required specific solutions, meaning that we could use local materials to build buildings. So in terms of mobile architecture, might be a solution. Today, more and more people living in smaller and smaller spaces. You know, this a whole revolution of mini homes, right? Where people are living in very tight spaces because we're traveling through our computers virtually, or we're mobile. So we might move the structures with us. The same thing that might happen on the moon. We're working right now on this, basically a habitable rover that can actually explore the moon, explore the surface of the moon before we actually build the base, before we actually build a stable architecture, truly understanding the location, understanding the sites. So the idea is to create this rover that, again, is self-sufficient. It has its own water system. It has solar power, and so on. Very much independent structures, which is really a bit of what we're doing here. This is a photograph of the South Pole. The flags are around the post of where the Earth turns. We were lucky enough to win the competition for kind of a design of the South Pole station, and believe that we won this competition because we thought about it in terms of a lunar base. You know, our experiences, or a space station. Truly independent structures that need to be highly efficient, easily to build, you know, with speed, and be a very smart building with more and more sensors. I think today with the amount of artificial intelligence that we have and so on, we can build extremely smart buildings. But after all this experience over the long years that I've been on this planet, I've turned around and we're starting to think about Spaceship Earth, looking at the Earth as a spaceship, looking at it in a systematic way and how we should operate it. Like the old Bucky Fuller concept of, you know, Spaceship Earth didn't come with an operating manual like, you know, things that we buy. So we need to think about the operation of the Earth in a systemic way. And we all need to work together on it. As Dava explained, we have many satellites right now looking at the Earth in many different ways. We're learning, we're getting data that is amazing to understand it at a local level. EarthDNA is a nonprofit that I'm a co-founder of and president of it. And we're looking at it looking at the planet in a systemic way. You know, what are the 4 subsystems of the planet? The planet is air, land, oceans, and near space, because we're depending of low Earth orbit. We're depending of the near space because all the phones and communications, all this understanding of the planet comes from low Earth orbit, comes from these satellites that are observing the planet. So, and how do we affect that? We can look at it in terms of the actual business. What are we doing on this planet? How are we changing ourselves really to support the planet? We need to do it at all levels, and we might not be able to wait for regulations as we are talking about in terms of regulation of governments that might change. So every one of us need to think about it like we're crew of the space station Earth. Everyone sitting here, we all have a role on how we behave. From the point of view of what we eat, what we buy, how do we conduct ourselves to this planet, and as we design things in terms of architects, use the planet as really as a part of the client, as a requirement, in terms of really when Earth becomes almost a major element of the requirements of our design. Think about it in that sense. And small and medium businesses, small and medium enterprises and businesses are what we're focusing on. How do we change industries? How do we put people together to think about new materials and new ways of manufacturing, new ways of doing things? And the other one is actually creating an army of ambassadors. Everywhere you go, there's embassies. We're in this neighborhood where there's so many embassies. There's no embassy for the Earth. And one of the things that we're training is young individuals that will become an army of ambassadors that we will deploy around the world to think about the Earth, and then think in terms of it globally, because the changes need to be global, but act locally. So teach people to how do they fix their own problems. Everything is like energy. Every site, every country, every location has a different solution. There's no single solution in terms of energy. If we're talking about energy today, our feeling is truly that you need to think about it in terms of the specific site. So I'll leave you with a statement and this mantra that we use from Buckminster Fuller, that we need to make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or disadvantage to space. And today we have the technology to spontaneously act. We have these little machines that all of us have in our pockets that we can collaborate, we can work together, we can exchange ideas, and we can make things happen. All these dreams that Bucky had before all these technologies were invented maybe weren't possible then, but they were certainly possible today. Thanks. Okay.
So same drill as before. Please join me on stage for the Q&A. Which I will kick off once again with my own questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So the first question for Frédérick. It's not a particularly cheerful one, but let's start with that. So your slides illustrate the formidable magnitude of the decarbonization challenges facing humanity in the coming decades. Transition to low-carbon energy sources is essential. However, I believe that broad and often conflicting range of national priorities, for example, decarbonization versus economic development, and regional dynamics, for example, interdependencies of energy supply, makes it very unlikely that a complete transition away from fossil fuels will be feasible before mid-century. If that's the case, shouldn't we start to think about and prepare much more seriously for climate adaptation, not just climate mitigation? And what will that effort look like? And I will say adaptation will also require enormous amounts of energy. What are your thoughts?
Thank you for this important question. As an engineer and physicist, I would say I prefer to work as the cause instead to work at the consequences. Definitely, I try to demonstrate we have to, our first priority is really to go to reduce the fossil and to reduce the CO2 emission. And we have to set that as the first priority. And what I said also in my conclusion, that it will take time. If we are convincing people to do that with the time constant of the Earth, it will take decades. And I think definitely we have also to foresee adaptation. We know already that 1.5 degree is over, and we are going very fast to 2 degrees, maybe 3 degrees. Then we know it is between 1.5 and 2 degrees is a big difference, and 2 to 3 big difference. And also people were speaking about global warming. I think I was discussing with people, people thinking in French is réchauffement climatique. People are thinking that Paris will become Barcelona. Very nice, but Paris will not become Barcelona. Paris will become Sevilla during 2 days. It will become Oslo after that. It will go Manaus in a few days. And it will be not a global warming like that. It will be a climate crisis. And this is very important. Saying that, we have to adapt to that. And I think you discussed about in terms of residencies and so on. We have to select crops that will fit with the things, and we have to look at with some region where we have lack of water, we have some flood and so on. Definitely we have to invest money in adaptation. And one thing I think is migration. I think we have to be ready to have massive migration due to climate change. And we have to look at that. We have to look at how to adapt our country, our city, to welcome these people to do that, and to maybe to have shelter, to have some life, and to take the talents of the people that will be obliged to migrate due to the climate change. Then I fully agree with you. First priority to fight against the CO2 emission, and in parallel to adapt and to think how to adapt the things that will happen in the next 20, 30 years.
Yeah, very good point. Mitigation and adaptation are certainly not conflicting goals. They should be pursued in parallel. Like any sound strategy, you need multiple shots on goal. So this is part of that sound strategy. Thank you. Let's go to Dava. I think in one of your slides, at least the ones that I reviewed a few days ago, he said safeguarding humanity and all living things, which is an incredibly ambitious goal. At the moment, we're seeing the opposite trend, unfortunately. Animal species disappearing at an alarming rate, and in agriculture, down selection to over-specialized crops and livestock that maximize the production of food and minimize its cost, often at the expenses of biological diversity and long-term health of humans, animals, and the environment. So how does your research impact the efforts to reverse these worrisome trends? Help us make that connection.
So thank you. Huge question. Yes, safeguarding humanity. In reply...
No pressure.
Yeah. In reply, I'll give a short reply, hopefully short, but 3 important points. First, changing human behavior. That's the hard part. The technology is the easy part. How do we move hearts and minds? How do we really move to action? How do we change human behavior? It's hard, but I think establishing the compassionate, empathetic relationship with all living things on Earth, again, so then maybe starting in the oceans, because it's the largest ecosystem that we really don't understand and explore. So, and we have a new opera, we, meaning collective colleagues and whatnot, you know, the Overstory coming up, an opera, some Richard Powers' book, The Overstory, where the trees, the plants are the actors. They'll take over symphony halls of the world. So will that maybe just again, one experience, one incredible performance really moves you to tears, moves you to action. So we're gonna try everything. But first, I think it's hopefully changing and helping people change human behavior and actions. The technologies, I am a technologist, so with our technologies, painting those pictures of the future flood scenarios, the future fire scenarios, not to scare anyone, not to overwhelm, but to help people to save lives, to get people out of harm's ways so they know emergency routes. So serving up the data so that it can bring about safety and resilience and the adaptation that we're talking about here, not just all mitigation, but adaptation and living in a more resilient, sustainable world. So it's a big ask in terms of safeguarding humanity, but scaling things up. And the ambassadors that Gay talked about, educating, my hope, I'm very optimistic. It's always about my students and the next generation and their generation. If we just help, it's always about the future generations. And millions of people can act, but if you scale that to billions and billions, then I think we can really accelerate positive change.
Yeah. One aspect you didn't mention in your answer, but I know it's dear to your heart and central to your research, is that the data that are collected from space that you showed here on the slides are essential actually to informing the policies, both mitigation, adaptation, all of the above. And so that's another area where definitely your research has an impact there. But yeah, we hear you loud and clear. Behavior of individuals and technology are certainly going to be the pillars. So let's move on to Guillermo. You touched upon this in your presentation, and I know that a concept central to your strategy is this idea that Earth is a spaceship, and you started elaborating there. So elaborate a little bit more. Tell us why is it important and timely, and how are you implementing it? It's a very sort of catchy, intellectually intriguing concept that we're all members of the crew of a spaceship, which is literally moving across space. How do you translate that into, I don't know, policy action on a global scale that can really make a difference?
Well, I think it's all of it. Maybe I didn't go in depth on that graphic, but it's really to affect academia, actually the consumers, all of us, the businesses, and eventually government. And it might work both ways. So, the solution is not there's no single bullet that we're going to solve these problems, but it definitely requires action. The planet, if you look at it, is all tied together. We cannot afford to lose species. We cannot afford to lose plants. We cannot afford to lose animals. So it's not just the survival of humans and the ego that we have in terms of we do whatever it takes. We're using the earth and killing the earth for us to survive. And we don't understand that actually we know we need everything on the planet to survive. So the maintenance of the planet is really the key to our survival. And that includes all living things, having empathy for the planet. So I think one of the solutions, that we have, and we have different areas that we will act, but specifically, initially is the ambassadors program, where we are training young people. Not only, the young people are incredibly knowledgeable about what is going on the planet, because they're the ones that are going to be living in it. I'll probably be gone by the time all this hits the reality of our lives. So today is about, truly creating leaders, creating leadership with knowledge. So young people that can be educated about what's going on, so they can explain it to their communities, understand what is going on, whether it's in Africa, in Central America, here in Europe, or in the United States, or whatever it is in the planet. There are local solutions to some of the problems that they have as a community. So I'm not sure that we can wait for local governments to do anything. As we know, politicians are getting more and more extreme. There's more, moving to staying in power rather than their own countries, much less the planet, right? This is the realities that we live. So we as citizens need to act, and we have these little tools that we can make changes, as what is going on right now, for instance, with companies that are moving away from Russia because of the moral issues that are going on right now by their invasion. So that power comes through communication, and we have it. We have today the power and the knowledge through all this data. And Earth DNA, by the way, is data in action, the Earth data in action, because we are relying in terms of true understanding of what is going on. We can measure these things. So we can create teams, groups of people around the planet that are working independent, and then actually try to get together. And this is where Earth DNA does. It's not about the group itself. It's about really leveraging the power of all the people that are working on this in the planet. Every country that I go to, it could be a small island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. There are environmentalists there, saving the reefs, cleaning their beaches, really understanding their local environment. And so they can, in the middle of the Pacific, can be communicating with us today live if we wanted to. And we can bring people to express, their interest and their needs, and then communicate solutions.
Very good. Yeah.
Maybe it's a long answer
information and
to
knowledge.
a big problem.
But good answer. So we have a few minutes for a couple of questions from the audience. Same drill as before. There is one up there.
So, hello, my name is Victoria, And, well, my question goes for Frédérick, but it could be answered by all. And is that at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that in the past we were already sustainable because we use power produced by human strength. And that reminds me of some activities that we perform nowadays that we use technology, and at the beginning we didn't. That can be discussed if it's really necessary, and we are, as for example, riding an electrical bike. And as I said, that it could be discussed if it's really necessary to use energy in those activities, and if for example, is creating an impact, an ecological impact that is not necessary. So my question is if there's something from the past that we can learn and that may not have been changed or not, or just partially, and that can also deal with a massive energy demand and with the increase of population. Thank you.
Okay, good point. What I tried to show to you is true. The world was sustainable, but I don't want to come back to this world, because I show also that the condition of life, life expectancy, the working things, if you have any medical problem, it was not so easy and so on. I don't want to come back to that. Saying that, it's true that at the time we discovered, thanks to the engineer, or sorry to the engineer, we discovered machines, steam machines and so on. And we had to look at it underground. It was too good. Nature provided us underground coal, oil and things. It was free from the nature, but millions of years to do that. We have now to think, it was something for development, but now we have to think, we should have think before, but now we have to think how to use other type of energy. We have technology, I think we discussed through that. We have now technology, and we just to do that. Your small example of electrical bike. I have an electrical bike. Now when I have no car, I think individual car is something completely crazy. We must have share car, we must electrical bicycle. I'm using electrical bicycle in Paris, in Geneva, where I'm living, because I can go further, I can go to work, I can go to the things, and it's better than to use a car and so on. I could use a pure bike, but I will not. Then I think it's always a compromise and so on. And if you are producing electricity by zero emission of CO2, why not? But I don't know. But the main problem now we are trying to show is a correlation between energy, GDP, and so on. And we have to break the things to limit our emission and to look at how we can continue not doing a completely breakdown of the GDP. But it's a challenge for humanity.
Yeah, I was going to say, definitely for me goes regular bike first, electric bike I really have to, car last. So, we have a few seconds for another question from the audience. Another one back there.
Hi, okay. Hi, I'm Astrid, and I would like to ask you two different questions, okay? The first question is with regards to the magnetic field. I hear the magnetic field is been changing and is becoming weaker, and imagine because of the CO2, okay? Another question that I have is that have you seen any significant difference in terms of the ozone hole in Australia? Have been seen?
This is, let's start with magnetic field. Earth is maybe for the space section of the...
Yeah, I can handle the... No, but the Earth's magnetic field is very stable. It's very robust. It's very stable. Over 4.5 billion years, we're good. Yeah.
But
some good news in this debate.
Mars not so much. Mars lost its electromagnetic field 3.5 billion years ago. But
the magnetic field changed time to time. It was a change every 20,000 years. It was completely a flip-flop of magnetic field.
20,000 years.
Yes.
So we got time. We got urgent priorities.
But not for human extinction.
Yeah, but part of it is that there's no impact in the atmosphere because of the change of magnetic field. There's different magnetic areas that the Earth has. So, you know, if you look at a compass, it changes in different locations. The magnetic field is different, but it's not diminishing.
Yeah. Any comment on the ozone hole? I thought that's getting better. That's also good news, isn't it?
Yeah, so we can briefly comment on it for you. So the ozone hole, that's, again, we're optimistic. So that was a huge problem, 2-3 decades ago for the ozone. We took the measurements. We saw the ozone, especially over the South Atlantic anomaly, so especially over South America. And the world came together. The world came together. This is a great example of scientific fact and then policy and the world uniting and saying, we got this. And, we're going to ban fluorocarbons. And so we got that. And we have a little issues now with the ozone hole, but it's a great positive example that the world can do this. We can unite. We can have policies, standards, in this case, ban detrimental emissions.
Well put. I have to say the magnitude of the challenge for decarbonization versus eliminating, ozone damaging layers is much greater. But I agree with you 100%. Such a nice example of the world coming together and solving a real problem. So
and done very, very quickly.
And done quickly. Yeah. Absolutely. Time is up. I don't know how much flexibility we have. I'm looking at the host. Can we take another question or so? Do you want to make any closing remarks? Yes. You're allowed to.
Okay. Does this work? Yes.
It works.
So if I indulge myself, given this opportunity, I'd just like to perhaps draw attention to an earlier question, and that is the electric bike, the electric car. Think of the battery as something that in the first instance is going to double the weight of the vehicle. So it's going to need more energy to perform as well as a current conventional vehicle. Instead of squirting fossil fuel into the tank, think of the battery as a tank, and you're squirting electricity into it. Now, electricity is arguably, like the city, one of our greatest inventions. We take it for granted that we can throw a switch, we have illumination, heating, everything that we take for granted. But 84% of that electricity is currently generated by fossil fuel. The remaining 16%, probably half of that is hydro. And half of the remaining 8 is renewable, as opposed to nuclear. So if that electricity is made by fossil fuel, it's a dirty car. Because the electricity is not a source of energy, it's just a means of moving energy. So really, the challenge is to embrace the renewables, but to accelerate research into fusion and to optimize on the new generation of nuclear and to call into question fundamentally some of the things that we take for granted. It wasn't that long ago we took for granted that if we used a telephone, there were long lengths of wire, there were telephone exchanges with hundreds of people moving little plugs in and out. Totally obsolete. In no time whatsoever. We take for granted that 2.5 million people in California are without electricity one summer because the aging infrastructure catches the trees alight, and that energy provider is already bankrupt. So we're on the verge of the potential for a revolution that can call into question the big grid. And as we've seen, and what's not been talked about is the kind of devil in the room of safety or control of waste. And all those negatives where you have, very, very curiously at the moment, in terms of policy, you have the UK going nuclear. You have Germany, part of Europe, which is funding the war in Ukraine to the tune of €1 billion every day. and at the same time is shutting down nuclear power plants which have the safest by a massive margin, including every known disaster, Chernobyl, the safest record. We spew 40 billion tons of noxious stuff into the atmosphere, and we worry about the only source of energy which we have total control over. And as Jacopo demonstrated, if that waste for one person in his lifetime would fill a tiny cup, and it's totally controllable. It's not going anywhere. It's not creating the poor air quality, which every year kills 10 million people on the planet, most of them young kids who are breathing in the fumes from coal, from fossil fuels. So I think we have to avoid emotion and prejudice and confront scientifically some of the realities. Because as Bucky said, we have the technology. We don't have to lower the quality of our lives. We need to extend it to those who don't share it. And we can do it. And technology, in my view, much derided, is the answer. The history of civilization is the history of technology. It's about life expectancy. It's about avoiding hunger. It's about education. It's about all the positive, optimistic things. What was the question?
Norman, thank you very much. I think with that ringing endorsement of the power of technology is a fitting closing remark to this great debate. So please join me in thanking not just the 3 speakers on the stage now, but all 7 of them once again. And with that, we wish you a great rest of the day here in Madrid. And please feel free to reach out to any of us here if you have any questions or comments about what was presented today. The discussion certainly does not end today, and we hope it begins with many of you. So with that, thank you again.